Well, one of the things which I was sure of right from the beginning, and one always writes books to demonstrate that your prejudices were correct, was that there aren't any villains. I mean, these people, the soldiers, the politicians, the scientists in all the countries, Russia included, were mostly honourable and decent and patriotic men doing what they thought was their duty. And I think that's the interesting question. How is it that these people find themselves trapped in an absurd situation where they are planning to set up systems which can kill millions and millions or even hundreds of millions of people? I mean, this is pretty odd for decent people to do. Mm. And the conclusion I came to was that they were all, and we are all, trapped in a situation where this thing's been invented. If you're a senior politician, you have a duty to your country. You can't afford to let those guys get it and blackmail you without taking countermeasures, which means there is a vicious circle. And so I wouldn't actually blame any of them. As a class, everybody was trapped in the same awful situation.
As an author, of course, you had a very distinguished career as a very senior British diplomat. And that job, of course, is highly partisan. You're batting for Britain, you're giving Britain's version of events to other countries, and then yet you were able, in your post-Foreign Office life, to write a book which, as you've just described, is remarkably unjudgmental about an issue, the annihilation of humanity, which has divided opinion. How were you able to make that shift from being, in a sense, very partisan in your professional diplomatic life to being remarkably, if I may say so, sort of even-handed in your description of those events?
Well, I wouldn't agree with your description of my professional job. I mean, it's a difficult thing, you know, and the Foreign Office, as you know, is always being blamed for being on their side and understanding them too well. If you don't understand them, you can't advise your government on how to deal with them. So you have to balance somehow between, on the one hand, you're working for your government, you're paid by them, but on the other hand, if you don't understand them, and that means, very important word, empathize with them, not sympathize, but you have to have a feeling for what their concerns are. Otherwise, you won't know what the hell's up. And one of the things that went wrong during the Cold War was the lack of empathy on both sides, the paranoia on both sides. And if I can go on just a second, one of the remarkable things about Ronald Reagan was he suddenly realized a truth which surprised him. The Russians are as scared of us as we are of them. He said, that's ridiculous. He says, we're not going to attack the Russians, but they don't know that. That was a great insight and a very important one, and it was quite rare during the Cold War.
One of the many things that I found certainly challenged my preconceptions was indeed your description of Ronald Reagan. But in terms of empathy, I think your book starts with the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima, and you then describe how in many ways, of course, in Russia there was then a very strong feeling of, oh, if the Americans have got those weapons, we need them. What was that the beginning of the chain reaction, and do you think the West consistently failed to understand that that was an inevitable, perhaps understandable reaction in the corridors of power in Moscow?
I think it was an inevitable, understandable reaction, but what was the West to do about it? I mean, you know, we'd got the thing, now they start wanting to get it. You know, the motivation has always been from the beginning. The original bomb was built because we were afraid Hitler might get it. Mm. Hitler didn't get it, so by a complicated process it was dropped on the Japanese, but at that point Stalin was determined to have it. And he got it, and so what were we to do? Roll over? So you get this awful spiral happening.
Which is, I should stress, absolutely, I mean, so well described in the book. Final question, I think quite literally the last line in the book, in that you have a sort of timeline, a description of the chronology of the nuclear confrontation at the very end of the book. And I think the very last line says something like, on the day or immediately after Donald Trump was elected as President of the United States, the Doomsday Book, I don't know who keeps the Doomsday Clock, I don't know who keeps the Doomsday Clock, moved an ominous minute closer to midnight, indicating a level of peril and danger to the world which is unprecedented. Do you think that the state of the world today and the possible use of nuclear weapons today is now as dangerous and as easy to envisage as it was at the height of the nuclear confrontation of the Cold War?
Definitely not. I don't believe in the phrase the new Cold War. The old Cold War was a confrontation, an ideological and military confrontation between two superpowers who were capable of wiping one another out at 15 minutes' notice. That is not the case today. Something much more complicated is going on. The doomsday clock was invented by the Federation of American Scientists shortly after Hiroshima, and they have a masthead on their, where the thing goes backwards and forwards. I simply don't believe that it's closer than it was. But the last line of the book actually is slightly different, as I remember, if I remember correctly.
You wrote it.
Well, but what I say, Kennedy said in '61, we're living under the sword of Damocles. Everybody in the world is under this threat. And the final thing in the book is the thread that holds the sword of Damocles is thicker than it was. The risk is less, but the sword is still there.